Hello to everyone, I'm Marco Rizzo from the Department of Psychology at the University of Turin, and today I'm presenting you a study entitled Religiously Flexible, Acculturation of Second-Generation Muslims in Europe. The literature says that immigrants, when arrive in a new country, they have to reconcile the identity of their country of origin with the society of the host country. But the relevance of cultural and religious differences, as in the case of Muslim immigrants in Europe, does not make this process easy. Such a process of cultural adaptation has been studied in academic research according to the bidimensional model of acculturation that affirms how immigrant groups may change their attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs through a long-term contact with other cultural groups. And this change involves the way immigrants shift their cultural preferences by adopting the mainstream culture while maintaining their heritage culture. As is well known, acculturation does not take place in a social vacuum, but considers contextual and individual aspects. As can be seen, here are presented just some non-exhaustive examples of acculturation conditions, such as the characteristics of the host societies among the contextual aspects. In detail, several reports indicate that Muslim immigrants are perceived by European citizens to be in greater numbers than they actually are. Specifically, the percentage of Muslims in Europe is estimated about 5%. In almost European countries, anyway, the perception of this presence is around 20%. So these figures reflect the difficulty of European society to fully accept the presence of Muslims in Europe. Closely related to this is the consistent growing of an anti-Islamic sentiment in Europe, leading to restrictive policies by governments on Islamic practices and episodes of discrimination against Muslims by European citizens in the form of verbal and/or physical attacks. Not surprisingly, the widespread anti-Islamic sentiment is leading Muslims in Europe to feel increasingly discriminated for religious reasons. Literature shows that high levels of perceived discrimination may result in two forms of identification. On the one side, the reaction identification model suggests that perceived discrimination can lead Muslim immigrants to separate themselves from the host society by affirming their heritage culture. On the other side, the reaction disidentification model can lead Muslim immigrants to distance themselves from their host societies by refusing the mainstream culture. Among the other acculturation conditions, literature has underscored that religion is another important aspect. Indeed, Islam, as other religions, is an example where culture and religion are strictly intertwined. Religion itself may be considered as a form of culture because it includes key aspects of culture such as shared values, principles, and habits. So, the Islamic religion is not only a set of practices according to the 5 pillars, but it guides people in their search of meaning in life, influencing every aspect of the life of its followers, including the education of children and the shaping of social relationships. So, according to the acculturation theory, high levels of religiosity has been found strictly related to the maintenance of heritage culture. The relevance of perceived discrimination and religious affiliation has been confirmed in recent decades not only for the first generation of Muslim immigrants, but also for subsequent generations. Second-generation Muslim, intending as people born in European countries or arrived in early childhood, represents the main focus of our study. Like other second generations, young Muslims are looking for a way to reconcile the cultural sets of which they are part. But unlike other second generation, these sets include a minority religion in Christian and secular contexts. Again, this backdrop, the need to reconcile two cultural perspectives can be understood as the outcome of a dual pressure. On the one side, second generation Muslims receive the intergenerational transmission of cultural heritage through their family and ethnic community, which include religious education. This reflects the parents' desires in concert to fulfill their moral and religious duty to pass on Islamic principles to their children. On the other hand, young Muslim generation are also oriented to the culture of the country where they grew up, even if they usually feel more pressure than their parents to assimilate into the mainstream society by European citizens that see this possibility as the only way to fully recognize young Muslims in the social fabric. So the main issue is how second-generation Muslims may find a way to successfully integrate their religious affiliation into a dual cultural set. For some second-generation Muslims who discriminated, individual effort may be needed to flexibly adapt to changing cultural circumstances rather than separate themselves from the host society. And in this regard, we think that the concept of flexibility in existential quest can be included as an individual aspect for second-generation Muslims in the adoption of mainstream culture. And the concept is defined as the willingness to legitimize different perspectives on existential issues, including an individual uncertainty about existential questions, a positive valorization of doubt, and an openness to change. So, while maintenance of the heritage culture is primarily related to adherence to Islam, the adoption of mainstream culture may be fostered by the ability of second-generation Muslims to reflect on existential issues, including a conceptualization of religion different from that of their parents or first generation. So, it is plausible that second-generation Muslims conceptualize Islam as a religion that can be questioned and that can coexist with other cultural sets. To sum up, the aim of the present study was to investigate the role of religiosity, perceived discrimination, and existential quest in the acculturation of second-generation Muslims in Europe. And to do this, we follow this hypothesis. So, high levels of religiosity are expected to be positively associated with maintenance of heritage culture. High levels of perceived discrimination are expected to be positively associated with maintenance of heritage culture and negative association with the adoption of mainstream culture, and high levels of flexibility in existential quest are expected to be positively associated with the adoption of mainstream culture. Furthermore, we recruited participants from two European countries, Belgium and Italy. Both countries share similarities in culture and religion, but differ in the composition of the second-generation Muslim population and in their legal recognition. In Belgium, Islam has been fully recognized since 1974, while the Italian state has yet to officially recognize Islam, forcing cultural and Islamic associations to create alternative spaces for professing their faith. Also, the Islamophobic sentiment runs high in both countries, with episodes of religious discrimination against Muslims commonly reported. As can be seen, the majority of both samples were women, while the Belgian sample was older than the Italian sample. Also, most of the Italian participants were university students, and in both samples, the majority of participants come from Morocco, even if in the Belgian sample, a consistent part of participants has parents from a mixed household, so with only one parent coming from Islamic country. Participants responding to an online questionnaire, and they were recruited from cultural and religious associations in both countries. Data were analyzed through a multi-group structural equation model, so we first test for measurement invariance, and once achieved the equality of measures in both samples, we test our hypothesis. Here are presented the main instruments in the questionnaire, so a scale of flexibility in existential quest, a scale of religiosity according to the four religious dimensions, a scale of acculturation according to the bidimensional model, and an index of perceived discrimination, which reports the levels of discrimination at work, in public spaces, and in daily life. The mean scores presented here showed how in both countries we found higher levels of religiosity, while the mean scores of flexibility in existential quest is slightly higher in the Italian sample than in the Belgian sample. And about the bivariate correlation, we found a positive correlation only in the Italian sample between flexibility in existential quest and mainstream orientation. Here are presented the fit of the model, both of the baseline model, but specifically on the structural model, so where all the relationships are constrained to be equal across group. And the arrow in orange represents the only result that was different between the Belgian and the Italian sample. Here in detail, the association between existential quest and mainstream was positive and significant, but only in the Italian sample, while we confirm the strong association between religiosity and heritage in both samples, such as an unexpected association between religiosity and mainstream. Only the mainstream was associated with perceived discrimination negatively, while no association was found between perceived discrimination and heritage. So, we partially confirm our hypothesis about the role of religiosity, perceived discrimination, and flexibility in the acculturation process of second-generation Muslims. In detail, concerning the role of religiosity, its positive association with heritage culture confirmed the strict interconnection between religion and culture. However, the unexpected positive association between religiosity and the mainstream may be explained by the role that flexibility played in the model. Consistent with previous studies, we found a negative correlation between religiosity and flexibility in existential quests, suggesting that second-generation Muslims with high levels of existential flexibility are more likely to accept the mainstream culture, regardless the level of religiosity. About the role of perceived discrimination, we only found a negative relationship with mainstream orientation, and according to previous studies, repeated experience of religious discrimination by second-generation Muslims in both countries generally appears to produce a stronger refusal of the mainstream culture than the reinforcement of the heritage culture. While the tendency of all Italian second-generation Muslims to grapple with existential issues seems to help strengthen their ability to deal with their dual cultural pressure they face and to aid their adoption of mainstream culture. In other words, flexibility in existential quest could be an individual aspect that helps Italian second generation to feel part of mainstream society. A partial explanation for the lack of association between existential quest and mainstream orientation could be found in the characteristics of the respondents. Indeed, many Belgian respondents came from mixed households, so families in which only one parent was from Islamic countries. Growing up in a mixed family may provide an earlier exposition to a dual cultural frame of reference. To conclude, the study presents some limitations. First, the cross-sectional design precludes a causal understanding of the patterns of relationship. Also, the homogeneity of the Italian sample in the distribution of age and educational level represents another limit. And third, the participants were recruited mainly from public and private groups that share the importance of being Muslim. So this results in an overrepresentation of respondents who report very high levels of religiosity. Limitation aside, the study provides insight into the new generation of immigrants living in two European countries. Our findings show that some second-generation Muslims do not want to give up their religious affiliation, but want to express them in a social context that is generally reluctant about Islam. In a practical perspective, the dual cultural affiliation of second-generation Muslims may be an opportunity for national governments and European Union to implement policies in favor of cultural and religious pluralism. Such an inclusive policies must occur through forms of legal and social recognition so that young immigrants can perceive themselves as part of the larger society. A form of social recognition can be, for example, fostered by social contexts such as schools in which intercultural contact and acculturation develop. Finally, educational programs should foster among young immigrants and their native-born peers an openness, an attitude of openness toward other perspectives and social recognition of the individual qualities of others, as demonstrated in these studies through the flexibility and existential quest. And with this, thank you for your attention.